What's up, everybody? Jay here with the Story Geeks, and I thought I would go through. I watched the entire director's commentary from Zack Snyder relative to he did this Vero live stream effectively where he went in and watched Batman v Superman, the Ultimate Edition, and it's like 3.5 hours long. He watches the whole thing and then basically offers commentary on part of the movie and like what he was thinking about at that time. And I watched or I listened to the whole thing. I didn't watch the movie at the same time. I just listened to his commentary on the movie, and I thought, that's a lot of he gives a lot. It's a lot of time to watch. So what I thought I would do here is actually I would try and take all of his commentary that he was doing and then break that down into some of the aspects of the story that I thought were kind of more interesting to focus in on. So you don't have to watch the 3.5 hour program. You can just watch my video, which will be shorter, and I'll give you some of the insights that I thought were really interesting relative to what he was up to. So we're going to jump into that in just a minute here. Make sure you subscribe if you liked Batman v Superman or you hated it. Let me know in the comments as we go along. And if you have any questions relative to what he was talking about, leave those in the comments as well, and I can get to those. I'm just going to open up a new window here so I can get to my notes because I took a lot of notes. There's a lot to cover because he's basically every new scene in the movie, he's giving some sort of commentary. He did give a lot of commentary in terms of where they shot stuff and how they shot stuff. That stuff was not as interesting to me personally, and therefore I won't cover a lot of what he talked about there. What I'll mainly focus on is more of the story elements that when those things kind of showed up, I found them interesting. So there were some things I found interesting. There is one thing that I find kind of I don't think controversial is the right word, but the way that they handle Lex Luthor, I'm going to get into that. That's one of my last points that I jump into. But I jump into that because I think that it is. I think it's interesting. Let's put it that way. But yeah, let's jump into it. Subscribe if you are not subscribed already. Make sure you subscribe for more videos like this. But we're going to jump into Zack Snyder's director's commentary on Batman v Superman, and he was specifically commenting on the Ultimate Edition, which is by far the better edition, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I'm going to jump into I got a bunch of key takeaways basically on here, and I'm going to jump into that. My first key takeaway from this video, which I found really fascinating, and this is probably one of the only things that I'm going to reference as it relates to his process, because lots of directors have a process, and a lot of them talk about the behind the scenes of how they filmed something. And I could go into a whole bunch of discussion about that. But what I want to get into more is some of we know what happened in this trilogy of films that Zack Snyder had signed up for. And I actually think he wanted to do 5 whole films, starting with Man of Steel, then BVS, Batman v Superman, and then Justice League. And then he was going to do a couple more films after that. But of course, we know that didn't happen at all. He had a tragedy in his family, and then they brought in Joss Whedon to kind of finish up Justice League. We got a very different Justice League than Zack Snyder would have given us had it just been him. And we can tell that because if you look at what's in BVS and you compare that, then you can kind of see where that all went. But one of the first things that Snyder talks about that I thought was really cool is he has these large books, and these books are like all just blank pieces of paper. And he goes in and he does storyboards, and a storyboard is basically an illustration of each scene in the movie. And he goes down and does that like multiple illustrations for each the movie, and he does a lot of that himself. And so he has these giant script or storyboard books that he goes through and does that. I thought that's the one part of the process that I was going to bring up because I thought that was really cool. The fact that he does that, and the fact that he has he pays attention to how he's going to film the story in that level of detail is a really pretty cool thing. Another thing, if you didn't know this, I did not know this until I watched this commentary, was that Chris Terrio, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Chris Terrio just wrote most recently The Rise of Skywalker. Pretty controversial film, right? I love The Rise of Skywalker. I love BVS, but a lot of people have had issues with those films. Chris Terrio also wrote Batman v Superman. So he is not a stranger to controversy because both these films are fairly controversial in the way that they tackle the subject matter. The second thing I wanted to focus in on here is the relationship between Batman and Superman. And I actually really like this. This gets some critique because I think a lot of people really wanted to see Batman and Superman teaming up on screen together. And we don't get that here. We actually see a lot of clashing happening between Batman and Superman in BVS. Um, I don't know why people don't like that. I think that there's an element of the comic book community and even just the geek community at large, people who like science fiction, fantasy, and comic books. I think that there's certain people who go, I don't want to deconstruct the things that I have traditionally loved. I just want to see them on screen the way that they were intended to be shown. I am not like that. I like the deconstruction of what used to be and the creation of new things. I find that pretty fascinating, pretty interesting. So I like the deconstruction of the relationship between Batman and Superman, and it makes sense, right? Because in many regards, I think Zack Snyder was following the Christopher Nolan series of Batman films, the Dark Knight trilogy, in that he wanted to create a very realistic um take on these superheroes. Obviously, they're not realistic. So how would people interact in the real world given this ridiculousness that's happening around them? So I like the relationship between Batman and Superman, but he talked about the fact that Batman let's think about this for a minute. Batman is a human being. He's not superpowered, who has poured millions, if not billions, of dollars into becoming sort of superhuman in his own right, but it's all tech, right? It's all tech and training. And I think that that's a really cool setup is when we see in the beginning of the film, and Snyder talks a little bit about this as he's watching, is we see in the beginning of the film, Batman, a person who is trying to create order, Bruce Wayne, is trying to create order in this community of Gotham, and he's looking up and he's seeing Zod and Superman from Man of Steel clashing and fighting and just laying waste to a bunch of stuff. And I think in my mind, the way that Snyder talks about this, the way that Batman reacts to Superman is actually really interesting and really fascinating because Snyder also talked about this, which I think is really fascinating. Um, the in this take, Bruce Wayne would have had experienced what we experienced in relationship to the September 11th attacks in New York. And so he's reliving that as he's watching Superman face off against Zod. And I think that that's a really, really interesting place to put Batman. And he would be terrified of Superman because what does Superman represent to him? He is a human being who has risen out of his circumstances. Now, granted, he had a lot of wealth and material possessions to be able to do this, but that exists, and he exists to create order for Gotham because his parents died and it was very disordered, and he wants to solve that problem by solving the problem of crime in Gotham. And to have Superman be this godlike being who is kind of chaotic and fighting against Zod, it would be really, really scary for Batman. And so I think that this makes sense. And I liked Snyder's take on that, and I like the way that it works into the movie. Now, a quick note: if you haven't seen the Ultimate Edition of Batman v Superman, then I highly recommend that because the Ultimate Edition solves a lot of the story problems where you're like, I don't understand what's going on. It's longer. There's more that they showcase that is interesting there. One part of the film that I find a little bit weird, and he talked a little bit more about this. This is kind of an offhanded comment, so he didn't go into detail about this. But there's a scene in the film, early on in the film, where he's trying to set up Superman. The whole film, he's trying to set up Superman as a person that could be feared. He could be feared for people like Bruce Wayne. He could be feared by people like Lex Luthor. He could be feared by the general population. And so he's trying to set up Superman as this person who could be feared. And one of the ways to do that is that Lex Luthor kind of sets up this whole scenario where they're going to broadcast live the kidnapping of Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane. And then Superman's going to show up to rescue them. But in that process, we don't understand that those are bad guys that have done the kidnapping. And it looks like Superman is just killing people because he wants to kill people. And then kill is an interesting word there too, because I don't know that Superman's actually killing anybody in that scene, but it looks like that might be. I'm pretty sure he does though. Does he? I got to answer that in the questions. I can't remember. Again, I was watching just watching Snyder talk. I wasn't watching the movie again. I've seen it. I've seen it several times, and I really like it. But one of the things that Snyder said that I did not know or did not pick up on is that he said that Jimmy Olsen is technically a CIA spy. And he talked about the use of journalists in superhero films or superhero stories, and talked about how he kind of felt like they were I think he used I don't know what words he used, but it was sort of like underutilized, and he wanted to kind of like give Jimmy Olsen something more to do there. And of course, spoiler alert, this is going to have tons of spoilers in it, so if you haven't seen BVS and you don't want to be spoiled, then sign off. But Jimmy Olsen is supposed to be a CIA spy. Jimmy Olsen also dies, and he's kind of like, yeah, he died. And he actually says about Jimmy Olsen's character, well, this is the purpose that character served in this story. So not a lot of sympathy for old Jimmy Olsen there, but I thought that was kind of interesting that he was a CIA spy. I didn't need to know that he was a CIA spy. I kind of felt like that Jimmy was trying to get to explore this concept of what was going on with LexCorp and with this scenario involving these criminals, and that it wasn't that he was necessarily a CIA spy so much as it was that he was just trying to get the story. But that was at least Snyder's take on it, was that he is a spy. One of the things that I think that he does really well in Man of Steel, and he continues it here as well, and he talked about this, was seeing Superman and seeing life through the eyes of Superman, and having this altruistic, that everyone always calls Superman a Boy Scout, because he very basically sees the world in black and white and always tries to do the right thing. And Snyder said, I really wanted him to have to deal with gray areas. And of course, I like that. As a storyteller, I think it's interesting to put characters in a place where they have to deal with things like this. I think that's really fascinating. So I like that as well. By the way, at the end of this video, I'll give you my take on how I feel about Zack Snyder as a storyteller, because I think that that's a take that a lot of people have. A lot of people have very strong opinions on Zack Snyder. So I'll give you my take, but I'll give you it at the end of this video. Another part of the setup that I think tends to get lost, except in the Ultimate Edition, which is why I'm a fan of the Ultimate Edition and think you should check out the Ultimate Edition, is that it does a better job of showcasing how skeptical of Superman Batman is. And so Snyder talked about this, right? Lex Luthor is trying to heighten the skepticism of the world, really, but especially of Batman, by putting Superman in a position where he looks like a villain. And I think he's doing that for a couple of reasons. One, he doesn't want Superman to have all the power. Two, he wants to take power onto himself and have the world look at him, meaning Lex Luthor, as their savior, not as Superman as their savior. So he's trying to paint Superman as a villain. And I think that that's really a kind of a cool setup, because Superman's, again, a Boy Scout, meaning that he's just trying to do the right thing, but he's dealing with all of these gray areas. And so when Snyder puts Superman in this place, I keep saying Snyder, but everyone on the team who is a part of the creation of this story, when they put Superman in a place of being this Boy Scout that doesn't kind of realize that people are manipulating him and messing with him. And then you have Batman, who traditionally is super skeptical, a detective, the world's greatest detective. And then Lex Luthor as the master manipulator of all of this situation, trying to manipulate what's going on so that people see Superman as a bad guy and see Batman as maybe somebody who's trying to help them out. Although I think he tries to paint Batman as a bad guy in some cases too. I think that's a really good setup, because again, at the end of the day, Lex Luthor ultimately needs a good father figure who loves him. I think his need, he has that core need for that, to believe in something bigger than himself and to have that love for him. And yet Batman needs to have a sense of security that he's in control. That's what Batman always wants. Superman, on the other hand, just is trying to protect the world and wants to protect the world, and he probably needs actually a more personal connection. And so that's a really good setup for these three characters to be played off of one another. What's up, Monty? Thanks for joining us. And Monty says he still needs to sit down and watch the entire commentary. Yeah, you can watch the entire commentary, or you can just listen to me break it down. Either way, whatever you want to do. But it's 3.5 hours, and it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. But again, I'm trying to go through some of the main points here. What I'm not going to go through is I'm not going to go through some of the things that he talked about in terms of how they filmed things. So he'll talk about the filming location. They use a lot of downtown Detroit, it sounds like, in a lot of the filming. But, that's not core to the story or what these characters are doing. So I won't cover a lot of that. One of the things that Snyder continues to talk about, and he used to talk about this way back in Man of Steel. We did a podcast on the Story Geeks, did a podcast on Man of Steel. We've done a podcast on BVS and Justice League as well. But one of the things that he talks a lot about is exploring Superman as this Christ-like figure. And if you've watched the films, you know that he spends a lot of time doing that. He spends a lot of time showcasing Superman as a Christ-like figure. He puts him in, positions where he looks like the sign of the cross. He puts him in places where he's trying to be a savior type figure. Other people start to see him as a Christ-like figure there. It's an interesting take. Snyder's actual words were something along the lines of, we all have that as a background. We all kind of know that that's a cultural thing, that Jesus Christ was there to sort of save us. He didn't give that level of specificity. I'm adding that to it. And then he's comparing that to Superman in some way, shape, or form. He also talked a little bit about how we as humans today would view the gods. And so he talked about the Roman gods, the Greek gods, and these gods that were larger than life and ultimately generally speaking, would cause problems for humans in these really intense ways. I think the question that I like to ask, I like that he's doing this comparison, but ultimately it seems like a pretty, so this is my commentary on top of his commentary, because he's talking about, I'm trying to draw a correlation and trying to draw symbolism between Superman and Jesus Christ. I think it would be better to explore Superman more so as a Messiah. Now, people call Jesus Christ the Messiah. Some Christians call Jesus Christ the Messiah. But if you were to look at the definition of what Jesus Christ is meant to be, and you were to look at the definition of the Messiah and what the Messiah is supposed to do, and if you are someone who practices the Jewish religion, you can give greater detail to this. Is what this looks like. But my understanding of those two terms is that in Jewish history, the Messiah is looked at to restore the kingdom of Israel on earth. And in that kind of context, Superman is a pretty good one-to-one relationship for what that could look like for people, and why you might see people see Superman as the Messiah, because they're looking for someone to do a kingdom here on earth. And in the story of Jesus Christ, many of his disciples thought that he was going to become the Messiah and set up a kingdom on earth and restore the kingdom of Israel on earth. Now, for those people who are then Christians or Christ followers, they would say on top of that, basically that the Messiah, based on the Jewish understanding, was actually not supposed to bring the kingdom of Israel back to earth, but rather to bring back spiritual restoration between humanity and God the Father. And Jesus is basically, like, for lack of a better description, is the bridge between those two things. And so then Jesus Christ is the Messiah in the Christian worldview, but not to create an earthly kingdom, but rather to create connection between humanity and God the Father. So I actually think that when somebody like Zack Snyder compares Superman to Christ, this is where I'm going with this. It's actually better if you were to say that we're comparing Superman to the Messiah, somebody who's on Earth set to help humans deal with the threats to Earth or to their daily lives, to their comfort. The exploration of Superman as a Christ-like figure, I don't think it can go very far, because Christ wasn't battling. I mean, Christ is the person who said, "Turn the other cheek." He didn't punch anybody. Was he trying to save people? Yeah, but he's trying to save people by restoring their connection, their spiritual connection to God, not so much because he's not so much because he's trying to restore an earthly kingdom, so to speak. It's more of a spiritual kingdom that we're dealing with here. So I love exploring that. I really like Snyder's vision for it. I like the fact that he talks about it and that he's open about it. But I think it's actually better compared to the Messiah and our concept of the Messiah. And I love the fact that he's comparing that to the Greek gods, which I think is really, really, really interesting too. So again, that's stuff from the commentary that Snyder talks about, trying to draw those conclusions together. I also really like his brief vision of the future that he shows us into this apocalyptic Armageddon-like future. I think that that's really, really great because from a storytelling perspective, especially as you're building a franchise, and again, he was supposed to have like 5 movies. And as he's building this franchise, he's thinking, how can I get people excited about what's coming later? And so he's looking at this and saying, well, I can showcase what might end up happening if I showcase this vision of the future. It also raises the stakes, right? Because now it's not so much that, normally we would see Superman and go like, well, he's not going to turn bad, right? Like Superman is like always the good guy. I've already described him as the Boy Scout. He's the guy that's going to show up. Everything's going to be good. It's going to be cool. But by showing us a future wherein Superman looks bad, Superman is doing things that are bad, Superman and Batman are still fighting, we're going, well, what happened here? So from that standpoint, I really like it. And then obviously the Flash plays a role there as well. And the rest of the Justice League, I'm sure. So I really like that. I think the thing that could have been a little bit clearer in the film, and I think it's clearer for people who have been giant fans of the comics. And I am kind of like a big fan of comics, but I have not been able to read a lot of them. So my co-host on the Story Geeks podcast, one of my co-hosts, Daryl Smith, has been super into comics. And so he explains a lot of these things to me. But I think it would have been a little bit cooler if we had, if Darkseid had been foreshadowed a little bit more, that we knew he was coming. And that in this scene, we knew that Darkseid was controlling Superman. And he talked about that. He talks about the fact that Darkseid is basically controlling Superman. And that also that Superman blames Batman for Lois's death. So if you know that, then that future scene becomes a little bit more realized for you as you watch it. And one of the travesties of Justice League is that it completely throws this future completely out the door. Like this is not even a thing to be thought about in Justice League. And I think that that's part of the fact that Warner Brothers. So let's just take this for a second and say we're going to give Joss Whedon a huge pass because he was coming in to quote unquote fix or finish a movie that Warner Brothers was not super happy with. And I don't know why they weren't happy with it. I like Zack Snyder's vision for it. That's controversial. A lot of people don't. But Warner Brothers didn't like it, and Warner Brothers shifted everything around. So now in the context of this, this is why online, if you've seen the Snyder Cut stuff, there's a big fight about that, about whether or not there is a Snyder Cut and whether or not it should be released. The reason for that is because there were people like me who liked what Zack Snyder was doing and was like, that's cool. Let's get more of that. And then there's people that hated what Zack Snyder was doing. And they're like, we don't want any more of that whatsoever. And so the people who are like, release the Snyder Cut really want to see what Snyder's version of Justice League would have looked like. But Warner Brothers wasn't into that. They wanted to do something totally different. Monty says that the Snyder Cut can cure the pandemic, probably, or the Snyder Cut is what's causing the pandemic. And that could be the other thing. If you look at his version of Armageddon in the future scene here, you never know. Another thing that Snyder talks about is that there's a lesson for Superman, and Superman gets this lesson when he goes to meet with Jonathan Kent. So one of the things I find really cool about what Snyder did with Superman is that he has 2 father figures who are influencing him. He has obviously his dad from Krypton, Jor-El, and then he also has Jonathan Kent, his dad from Earth. And in Man of Steel, we see that Jor-El is able to using like an AI of Jor-El's memories, he's able to interact with Superman as he starts to explore his powers. In Batman versus Superman, or Batman v Superman, we see that Superman is calling back on memories of Jonathan Kent to have a conversation about how he should proceed. And one of the lessons that he learns, and I love this scene, is that he can't be impartial. He can't just not do something. He has to do something. He has to take a side. He should take the moral high ground and act. And of course, that's what Superman needs at that time. And I think that scene is really a really beautiful scene, and I really like it a lot. Snyder then talked about, following up with that, kind of talked about getting redemption in the eyes of your father, and how every single character in this story is trying to get redemption in the eyes of their father. So if you look at it from a standpoint of Batman, who had to witness his dad, Thomas Wayne, dying at the hands of a criminal, he's looking for redemption because he's trying to bring order to the chaos that is Gotham, and take his father's legacy and move on. And so that's what redemption would look like to Batman. If you look at redemption from the standpoint of Lex Luthor, you can kind of tell that Lex Luthor's dad was looking down on him because this whole like tech business idea, sort of his quirks were not what the old school business guys would have been like. And so he's looking maybe a little bit unfavorably on Lex Luthor. And I'm going to get into Lex Luthor more at the end of this video, because there's some, again, controversy that I want to talk about. So Lex is looking for redemption in terms of being like, I'm going to be the biggest businessman in the world, and my dad's not going to have anything to say about it. So there's that redemption there. But for Superman, that is more about maintaining this simple, straightforward morality that is a high moral standard, and Superman being able to take that on. And so that's what he's trying to explore here, is the redemption in the eyes of your father from all the different characters who appear, the main characters who appear here, which I think is really interesting. He talks, again, going back to the Christ-like comparisons of Superman. Zack Snyder talked about the symbol of the spear being the spear that pierced the side of Christ. And this is why I say, like, it's interesting to me to explore that. And I like talking about it because as a Christ follower, I like to be able to explore what that looks like in the real world, and like how we talk about it as a culture. But some of the metaphors that are being used get very weird. They don't work that well. And here's one that kind of doesn't work that well. So the spear that pierced the side of Christ was after Christ was crucified on the cross, to make sure that someone was actually dead before removing them from the cross. They would pierce their side with a spear, and then if it came out with a mixture of water and blood, then it was identification that the body had died. So it was a scientific approach to taking people down off if they were crucified. So that's the spear that pierced the side of Christ. That's what that's referring to. In this case, the spear is the spear that has the kryptonite in it, that is going to be the weapon that Lex Luthor uses against Superman. Or it might be that, is it Batman that creates it? Yeah, I think it might be I think it's actually Batman that creates it. Now that I think about it, one of the two of them created it. In the end, in this scene, it's Batman who has it, and that it being sort of like a parallel to the Superman getting stabbed is a parallel to the death of Jesus Christ. Again, it's sort of a weird metaphor, and I understand why they're doing it. And the other context that Snyder gave to the spear is that, yeah, you could. He said you could have made a bullet, but a spear requires you to be close in combat, requires you to be next to your enemy when you use it, and he felt like that was kind of interesting. Now, for a guy who created 300, also, right, pretty familiar with the use of spears because of that comic book film, I think that that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. It's a metaphor. It's not a perfect metaphor, but it's a metaphor. So that's all right. One of the things he also talked about was when Batman's helmet gets damaged, Superman is sort of able to see Batman, and the veil of Batman's identity is kind of removed. And so this broken helmet with Batman represents Superman being able to see that it's actually Bruce Wayne, and there's no more disconnect there. They know that to be what's going on. I'm not sure that that one comes through very clearly. That's more of a metaphor that maybe doesn't show up in the film all that much. But it's interesting, and I like the fact that he talked about it in this commentary. I did like a lot this. I like this a lot because I like exploring why Batman does what Batman does. And he talked about Batman and Batman's sense of morality. I usually refer to this as Batman's order to the chaos of Gotham City. So Gotham City is chaotic, it is corrupt, it is unjust, and then bring order to the chaos. And Zach talked about the fact that we can only live in a world, Batman can only live in a world where there's morality that he forces onto people, right? Which is different than Superman. Superman, and actually they talk about this in Man of Steel, is supposed to be the embodiment of what we're supposed to do. He's supposed to inspire us to be better. Batman is like, I don't care if you're inspired or not, you're going to be better because I say you're going to be better. And that's kind of how Batman works in this world. And so what he talked about was that when Batman and Superman are fighting, and I actually think this is really important to those of you who do not like the Martha scene. I will say, as much as I like this movie, the Martha scene is not done as well as it could be. And so it's left with you going like, well, I don't even get it. Yeah, sure, they have the same name, but like, why does this matter? What he explains here is actually really, really interesting. So Batman thinks that the only way to win is for him to force his morality, what looks like order to him, on other people. Now, in the context of most Batman stories, that order or that morality makes a lot of sense because of how chaotic and how corrupt and how unjust Gotham is. But when you mix Batman and Superman and you mix Metropolis and Gotham, all of a sudden Batman's morality being forced on other people, what does that sound like? It almost sounds like the Empire in Star Wars, right? Like it sounds like the First Order. We're going to bring order to the chaos. Well, that's negative. And so one of the things that I think that Snyder is talking about here, and in the commentary you get a better feel for it, is that what he's saying is that Batman enforcing his morality on Superman, enforcing order on Superman, saying like, you can't just destroy the city by fighting Zod. You have to play by my rules. By Batman fighting Superman, it puts Batman's own mom at risk. Okay, mentally for him. Why? Because Lex Luthor has Superman's mom, and now there's a callback here to Batman becoming the thing that he hates, the person who puts Martha in danger, the thing that he's been concerned about since he was a little kid. So Batman saw his parents murdered. Martha Wayne was murdered right in front of his eyes, and now he's trying to fight back against that crime. But what if you fighting back against the system actually was causing another Martha to die, a mother who's also a Martha to die? So Batman's solution to the problem actually contributes to the problem because he's trying to kill Superman and bring order to the situation. And by doing so, he will kill Martha, the proxy for his mom, who also happens to be Superman's mom. You might have to listen to that twice to get that. But I really think that that works. It works really well as a concept. Execution-wise, I don't know that it actually works great. But I think that as a concept, it's really, really cool. Monty says the Martha scene is my favorite "What have I done" moment in 2010 comic book movies. So there you go. So there's some people that like the Martha scene, and I think that that's exactly. So Monty is picking up on exactly what Zack Snyder wants him to pick up on. It's the "What have I done?" I just became the person who killed my mom by trying to do this, by trying to kill Superman. I'm becoming the person who killed my mom, and of course, the person who killed Batman's mom is different depending on what comic you read. So they're never fully identified. So anyways, that's an interesting view on the Martha scene. And again, I love it as a concept. I don't know that it's executed well to the point where it's understood that clearly. The Ultimate Edition helps, but it is what it is. One of the things that Zack Snyder talks about, and as story geeks, we think about this all the time, is like, what are our favorite stories and why are they our favorite stories? And Zack Snyder commented that The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen are two of his favorite comic books. And that makes sense. Like, he definitely is drawing some inspiration from The Dark Knight Returns here. And then also we know he did The Watchmen. And that was actually, I really like that movie. Watchmen is, like, I think a very good film. So I do love both those comics. So maybe that's why I like this film so much, because I can see where he's drawing inspiration from. So he also mentioned that it's his interpretation of The Dark Knight Returns, the comic, is that Batman does shoot someone in that comic. I don't remember that, so I would have to go back and look that up to make sure that that's true. Okay, last thing I want to talk about. Again, he talked about a lot of other things. A lot of the other things that he talked about were commentary on how he made the movie, not commentary on how the story is playing itself out. But this is one of the most controversial points, and he said something that I was bummed out about, and it's in relationship to Lex Luthor. So, in the comics, Lex Luthor, the guy, the Superman's enemy, the guy that is ruling over Metropolis in a way, obviously from a business standpoint, because he's not a government official or anything. Anyways, Lex Luthor has a son named Alexander Luthor. I believe Jesse Eisenberg's character is credited as Alexander Luthor. If not, that comes up somewhere. You see it someplace. I don't remember. So here's where things get interesting. Back when BVS came out, so like Monty's saying, it was back in like the 2010s. So after the aughts were over, whenever it came out, I think it was 2013, maybe it came out. Anyways, when it came out, there were actually articles written that, and even before it came out, that were basically saying that Jesse Eisenberg's character was indeed Alexander Luthor, and that Lex Luthor was Alexander Luthor's dad. So that Jesse Eisenberg was playing the son, not the traditional Lex Luthor that you might have seen, but actually the son of Lex Luthor. There were articles that were published about that. You can also find, I think there's a Polygon article out there that you can take a look at that's still out there. But the one I found was on MTV.com, and I could not find it later. I couldn't find it today. Like if I went and searched for it today, I probably couldn't find it. Maybe you can. Maybe you have better search skills than I have. But so here's the problem. I don't know if when Zack Snyder and Chris Terrio sat down to work on this film, I don't know if they meant for Jesse Eisenberg's character to be Alexander Luthor the son, or they meant for him to be Lex Luthor the father. Then the question is, well, why are these articles coming out? Well, Jesse Eisenberg's portrayal was pretty controversial because a lot of people did not see him as Lex Luthor. So I don't know if Warner Brothers or somebody on Snyder's team tried to leak the information, like, because it's very clear in the film itself that Jesse Eisenberg's character's dad's name is Lex Luthor. It's very clear. You can watch the film and see that, because Jesse Eisenberg is not the one that built LexCorp. His dad built LexCorp, or LexCorp, and then obviously like he's taking over. So I don't know if what the original intent of Jesse Eisenberg's character was supposed to be. If he was supposed to be the Lex Luthor we all know from the comics, or if he was supposed to be Alexander Luthor, the son of the guy that we would all know from the comics. And you can also, use Lex Luthor, the father, to come into the series at some point in time as well. But anyways, Snyder, and I actually made a quote here, because most of the time I've just been telling you that what he's kind of saying and paraphrasing it for you. But I wrote down the quote because I feel like what he's suggesting here is not what I want to believe about the character, because I don't want to believe that's the actual Lex Luthor. I want to believe it's Alexander Luthor. But Snyder said, you're on your way to seeing your iconic Lex. And he's referring to Jesse Eisenberg's character at the end of the film after he shaved his head. And he's saying you're on your way to seeing the iconic Lex Luthor relative to how Lex Luthor is portrayed more so in the comics. The dad Lex Luthor, not the son. And so that leads me to believe that he fully intends for Jesse Eisenberg's character to actually be Lex Luthor. So I don't know if he's going to get a different actor for the future. I don't know how that turned out. It remains sort of a mystery. I have no idea, but that still has not been cleared up. unless he really does believe that this is the kid Lex Luthor and that Lex Luthor will grow up into something else. But again, we're dealing with a weird timeline here because in most of the Superman mythology, Lex Luthor and Superman are closer to the same age, or Lex is older than him. There's very few times when Lex is younger than Superman. I can't even think of any in the comic. Now, I'm not well versed in Superman comics. But Lex Luthor is very much younger than Superman in this film. So I don't know. You could take that for whatever it's worth, but that's where I think there's a lot of controversy still, and it's not super clear how that was supposed to play itself out. And we don't get to see the rest of Zack Snyder's vision, so who knows? Maybe what Zack Snyder can do is actually take those storyboard books that he's done before and draw out the entire 5-arc series that he wanted, and then we can just read that, and that would be cool. Get scripts for that, and then see the storyboards for that. I would be down with that. Monty here says that's possible. My concepts, that's possible. But his thing is that going as far as to give him the red hair makes me 100% think that he's Lex Luthor, because Lex had red hair in the comics for a little bit. Yeah, and his son could have had red hair too. I mean, I have no idea, but this is open to interpretation. So I'm going to go ahead and end the video there. Monty, thanks for joining me on the live chat portion of this. If you have other questions for me, if you want to know what else he talked about that I didn't cover, or if you've heard people talking about this and you have a question relative to it, leave me a comment down below. Make sure you hit the like button for me as well. And then if you want to know more about us breaking down stories and digging deeper into stories, and I've been giving a lot of story recommendations while we're all in quarantine. I've been doing like what to watch on Netflix, what to watch on Disney Plus, and some of those kind of things. Then make sure you subscribe to this channel, hang out with us, and hang out with me on these live shows and give your opinions as well, just like Monty's been doing. In the meantime, like I said, hit the like button for me, leave me a comment, and I will talk to you guys on the next show.